Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello everybody, welcome to our noon book review. Normally Joe does the introduction because Joe has arranged the program, but I was very fortunate to be moderator of a panel that Linda Simon was on, and I read her book. I was totally hooked. It's great when you read the first chapter and then you can't stop, and that was the situation with me. So I was really happy that she was agreed to come back and talk about the book. Linda Simon is a professor at Skidmore. She's got her PhD from Brandeis University. Some of the books, and some are in the back, the biography of Alice B. Toklas, Thornton Wilder, Genuine Reality. She wrote The Critical Reception of Henry James. She edited a Gertrude Stein Remembered book, another book, William James Remembered. She's the general editor of the journal William James Studies, and editor of the series Mind in American Literature. I know that she also curated an exhibit on William James at Harvard last fall, and that was wonderful. We were able to put some of the photographs on the UAlbany website. So without further ado, I want to introduce Linda Simon.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really overwhelmed by how many people came out on Thursday afternoon to hear me talk about William James. And some of you may have read the biography, and some of you may know more or less about James, so I don't want to be talking about what you already know. I would rather know what you would like me to talk about. I had planned to just give you a little bit of background about the family, and then talk about William James's erratic path to become a philosopher and a psychologist, and then talk about why we're remembering him now. So I can do those three things, or I can eliminate. Anybody have any preference? Those three sound wonderful? Okie doke. Okay. William James came from money. Our William James. I have to tell you first that everybody alternately in the family was named either William or Henry, so you'll have to sort of keep tabs on which one I'm talking about. The grandfather, William, came to the Albany area. He was an immigrant from Ireland, and he made good. He owned land, he owned banks, he was a facilitator of the Erie Canal, and with his third wife, the first two young wives had died very early, one in childbirth, one shortly after that. With his third wife, he had a number of children, one of whom they named Henry, and that was the father of our William James and our Henry James, the novelist. So let's start then with our Henry James. Our Henry James, who we're going to call Henry Sr., because he was the paternal figure, was a kind of impetuous, hard-to-discipline child. And when he was an adolescent, he got into some trouble and burned one of his legs, and it had to be amputated. So from the time he was an early adolescent, he walked with a cane, with crutches, with an artificial leg, and this was a shaper of his personality in a way. On the one hand, he was an invalid, and on the other hand, he was beset with guilt because he had done this to himself. He was just horsing around, and then some hay got lit, and he got caught in it, and this was the outcome of it. He was not, in those days, there wasn't any counseling, parents hardly talked to children, so nobody really dealt with all of these feelings. And by the time he was college age, he was really a bad case. He went to Union College, pretty much spent his time there drinking, perhaps taking other imbibements. didn't do well. You know, his father had been one of the founders of Union College, so there was a lot of investment in terms of was he going to do well or not, and he didn't. He would run away. He would be found in Boston. You know, he was really hard to tame. He became a newspaperman for a while. Anyway, he didn't have much of a direction. He did, though, after a while, find somebody to marry, the friend of one of his friends. She was named Mary, and together they started a family. During the time that he affiliated himself with Mary, I guess you could say that Henry got religion. And he started to deal with some of the philosophical questions that were important to him at the time. Is the world one? Is there a God? How do we know there's a God? You know, the usual questions. He was also suffering from recurrent depression. I guess I should say that alcoholism ran in the family, so his imbibing during college wasn't something that the other people in the family hadn't done. There were a lot of alcoholics, and some of them came to a bad end. These were always held as sort of examples to Henry's children. He and Mary lived in the Albany area, then they moved down to New York. Every once in a while they would go to Europe. Now, how were they affording all of this? They were affording it because even though Henry had been cut out of his father's will because he was such a bad boy, he contested the will and then was left with an income that really supported him and the family, and there were also investments, always. So even as far as Henry and William and the other children of Henry and Mary, there was money in the family. And this is typical of the sort of intellectual elites of the time. At Harvard, I'm going to digress and then come back, but at Harvard, for example, when faculty were hired, it was necessary for them to have private income because Harvard wasn't paying a whole lot. So you have a whole sort of intellectual class that was also financially elite class, and they brought certain values to the institution, you know, to collegiate life. Well, in any case, Henry and Mary started having children. The first child they named William. That's our William. Being the eldest child is hard enough. Being the eldest child of Henry Sr. was a very, very big burden. The next child, about 15 months later, they called Henry, and that was our Henry the novelist. Then there were two other boys. They named them Robertson and Garth Wilkinson. And then there was a little girl, the youngest child, and her name is Alice. Even though that seems like an unusual name, as you'll see, there then became lots and lots and lots of Alices in the family. So it's very confusing, but if you have a genealogy in front of you, you can sort of pinpoint the one that you want to talk about. At one point, in one of the family's stays in England, Henry Sr. had a breakdown and became enlightened by the thought of Swedenborg. Okay, is he somebody that you've heard about? Well, Swedenborg was a sort of mystic. He believed that everybody was inhabited by the divine spirit, and that striving was not as important as just accepting God and being. Now, this was okay for Henry Sr. because he had a private income that would keep coming to him all the time, but this is not necessarily a realistic option, for example, for his children, who, you know, the income would be dissipated and then it would dwindle, and then what were they supposed to do? And besides, they were being brought up in a time of great striving. This was the latter half of the 19th century, and if the 19th century was characterized by anything, we can say great striving was one of those things. But Henry Sr. in his enlightened state insisted that he was going to protect his children from that influence. And from the time that he had his epiphany until the children were college age, Their education under his guidance was extremely erratic. They would go to school sometime, but really oddly. Like Henry the novelist was sent to do a business course. Something less appropriate cannot be imagined. Or William was sent to something and then withdrawn. Or tutors were hired and then fired. And basically what Henry Sr. was afraid of was having his children fall under the influence of others. He wanted to be the total focus of their lives. He was, I think we would call him now, narcissistic, and he wanted really to protect and to educate his children in a certain way, to be a certain kind of philosophical mind. William took this to heart. You know, he was the one that was supposed to really fulfill his father's dreams, and this was a great struggle for him. When he became of college age, and all of his friends were going to college, many of them to Union College, Henry Sr. refused to allow any of his children to go to college. He called them hotbeds of, you know, degradation, I mean, because of what had happened to him. So he wasn't about to allow that. So that path was closed to William. He did, however, say that William could maybe pursue a career, not a career, but maybe an interest in art. So William started studying art. Learned a couple of things. One, that he had talent. Two, that it was damn hard to earn your income as an artist. You would be forced to do things on commission, forced to do portraits. You know, it wasn't really the creative life that he had envisioned for himself. And he was afraid of ending up like his father, who by then was a sort of minor Emersonian figure. He would go and give talks, but not too many people came. He would write books, but nobody really understood them. He aspired to be a public intellectual, but he really couldn't do that. And William saw, you know, two examples. One, his father, who in terms of, you know, having a public career as a philosopher was a failure. And two, the artists that he studied with who were really struggling. You know, struggling to not do portraits of society women, for example, and do what they really wanted to do. Then the Civil War came along, and Henry Sr. decided that his eldest boys were too precious to allow them to fight in the war. But the next two didn't matter so much. They were expendable. So Robertson and Garth Wilkinson fought in the war, and Garth Wilkinson was wounded, and William and Henry stayed home. So I think you can see a pattern of sort of diminishing manliness, which especially for William James was a big problem. The other problem that he carried on into his professional life when he became a philosopher especially was the problem of authority. His father had positioned himself as the central and only authority in the children's life. And no matter how William tried to exert his own identity as against his father would say, no, that's not really how you feel. How you feel is different. This was a problem for William on the one hand, and for little Alice on the other hand, who just succumbed to it. But William managed to escape from it. After the art career was abandoned, which happened sort of in, well, no, I can't really say that. They were in Europe for a while. William was studying art. The father decided he could do so much better studying it in Newport, Rhode Island. This was the laughingstock of the friends of the Jameses, because if you're going to study art, wouldn't you stay in Rome or Paris or Florence? But anyway, they went back to Newport, Rhode Island. And the next try of independence was that William decided if the father was not going to send him to college, then perhaps he could go to what was then the Lawrence Scientific School. The father also had his own definition of science, and that definition was more like Thoreau, you know, where you would go out in nature and collect stuff. and then ruminate about how all of the stuff you collected was the expression of godliness. William had a different idea, that actually you could work in a laboratory and do experiments, but he kept that from the father, and so they made a deal, and William went to the Lawrence Scientific School. The family was in Rhode Island, William was in Cambridge, and then the family decided, we're too far apart from one another, we're going to move to Cambridge too. So then the whole family was in Cambridge, and William was at the Lawrence Scientific School. A career as a laboratory scientist didn't interest him that much. And by then, the options were sort of running out. You know, what was he going to do with his life? What was he going to be, especially in opposition to a father who would not let him be anything? While this was going on with William, I should say, although Henry is not my topic, Henry would leave. Okay, Henry would leave. He would go to Europe, he would write, he would submit stories to the North American Review or the Atlantic with the return address of a friend's house because he didn't want his parents to know what was going on, and he didn't, if anything had been rejected, he didn't want to have to be involved in a home life which did a really good job of pity. Okay, if the children were falling apart, if they were having breakdowns, if they were collapsing, the whole family would rally. If the children wanted to take an independent path, if they wanted to strike out on their own, if they wanted to show talent that was greater than the father's, well, then the whole family would fall apart until the children then would fall apart, and then the whole cycle could start all over again. So this was really a very interesting dysfunctional family. In contrast to some biographers of Henry who think that there was a very deep-seated rivalry between William and his brother Henry, I can only ask you to picture this kind of dysfunctional family and think how much those two older boys, intelligent, striving, wanting something for themselves, would need each other. So for them to be opposed to each other would be psychologically, I think, and all the evidence points to this, psychologically a really horrible situation. And I think that throughout their life, of course, there was a little bit of rivalry, and of course there was a little bit of joking around. But those two brothers were very, very close and empathetic toward one another. William finally wound up, after some severe emotional crises and depressions, at the Harvard Medical School. He did not want to be a physician, but it was one way that he could actually get something, you know, some kind of image of a career for himself. So he ended up at the Harvard Medical School, which at the time was shockingly inadequate, really shockingly inadequate. The good medical education was happening perhaps in Germany, but it definitely was not happening in Cambridge. And he thought that this was just a charade, but you know, there he was, and he went through the medical curriculum, at the end of which he told one of his friends, why don't we have a partnership? You see the patients, and I'll stay home and read. So at the end of that education with a medical degree, which is the only degree that William James ever had, he was again left with nothing to do and again facing a kind of emotional collapse. You know, what really was he going to do with his life? At around that time, I mean, there are digressions, but you know, we want to get to the good part of what he actually did do. Around that time, a friend of his was teaching anatomy at Harvard, anatomy and physiology, and the department needed a substitute. So the friend said, look, you can teach a course. Wouldn't you like to teach a course? And William said, without much conviction at all, yes. Then he said, no. Then he said, so finally he taught the course, and he really liked it. He liked teaching. He liked being in front of the classroom. He liked having actual other people below him so that he was in a position of authority. He'd never had that before. And this proved to be a good experience. Not that he never wavered from this either, but that was the start of his teaching career. He moved from anatomy and physiology to, oddly, philosophy, and then within the philosophy department branched out, because there was no discipline of psychology, into psychology. And that's where he did the work that we know about. And he spent his career at Harvard, although he made little moves to go to Johns Hopkins at some time. He thought he could get more money. Although, you know, as I said, the Jameses were wealthy. Still, times were changing, the economy was changing. He needed to have an income of his own, and the family income was not going to provide that. So he was at Harvard his whole career, and the question of authority and the religious questions that had been, you know, seeded in him by his father were very much alive throughout his whole career, except that they were directed someplace else. And as you know, one of the places that they were directed at in the 19th century was the possible authority of science. Could science actually tell us what the universe was? Could science tell us what God was? Was there God? You know, was there religion? Could you believe in God and still be somebody that valued scientific method? These were all very, very live questions at the time. You know, how do we know something? Does it only have to be scientific proof that is going to tell us what something, if something is real or not? What's the role of faith? So you know some of William James's works, right? One of the famous essays is The Will to Believe, which really was about this. And he said, I should have called this essay The Right to Believe, because he was arguing that even if you are, you know, a modern thinking person, even if you believe in scientific proof, you can still have faith. There's a function for faith in everybody's life. Part of this was to convince other people, part of it was to convince himself. James wished that he could feel more faith. He wished he could pray. He often said that. He married somebody who had firm faith, and he really depended on her, you know, her encouragement that he was a man of faith too, even if he couldn't enact some of the rites and rituals of Christianity. So The Will to Believe was one. Early in his career, he was asked by a publisher, a Boston publisher, you know, this was a small world and they were all friends, so he was asked by Holt if he would write a new psychology textbook on the new ideas, the sort of scientific perspective of psychology. And this was early in his marriage, and he said, yes, I'll have it for you in, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, 10 months. It took something like 10 years, 12 years before he published the Principles of Psychology, and that was groundbreaking. It certainly made his name. But he was not satisfied with psychology, and especially with the direction that psychology was going. James was, and he knew this from the Lawrence Scientific School, he was not really interested in laboratory work. That seemed rote. And laboratory work at the time was not really, admittedly, all that interesting. What psychology work was at that time was basically timing nerve reaction. So, you know, you'd have a hand, you'd get a prick, you'd respond to it, and then you'd write down how long it took to get the response. You can imagine that that would not interest James at all. He was much more interested in what was going on deeply in the hidden, what he called the hidden self. So that path was not going to go very far. And where he was most at home was in philosophy and questions of faith, religion, reality, and authority. And there are a handful of books that he wrote as a philosopher, which I think are his, of course, most famous. One is The Varieties of Religious Experience, which perhaps you know about. It's a sort of encyclopedia of every religious experience that people have found helpful. So across religions, across tradition or alternatives, or, he and his research assistants just accumulated all of this testimony, and this is testimony to the kind of experiences that can count as religious experience, that no one experience had precedent over another or more authority than another. So that was one very famous book. Then he got into questions that we know as pragmatism, pluralism, and what he called radical empiricism. He was countering prevalent rationalisms that were much more abstract. And James wanted to explain a philosophy that was rooted in experience and in changing experience. One of the key words to understanding James is the word novelty. He knew, and this is what we were talking about before I came up here, he knew that the world was changing rapidly. He was ready for this world in some ways, in other ways not. And maybe we can talk about that at the question time. But he was ready for a world that was changing all the time, and a world in which different constituencies claimed to have authority. And I think that is definitely our world now. I think the question of who to believe, right, about so many things, like how much radiation is safe. I mean, let's just take that one. So many things are questions that we need to figure out who to believe, why to believe, how to evaluate evidence, how to draw inferences for ourselves. I mean, these are all very complicated, and they were no less complicated in James's time. He started out as a philosopher in the age of Darwin, and if there was anything that shook up the notion of authority and religion, that was that. And he ended, he died in 1910, ended just before World War I. The world had completely changed. There were subways, there were x-rays, it was different. And then what were we going to do about it? And then where was God? So pragmatism posited that when you have an idea, the truth of an idea can be weighed according to its consequences. This has been so misunderstood as to mean nothing today, actually. I know you're going to discuss this book, and maybe you can sort it out. It doesn't mean that anything goes. It doesn't mean that what works is true. That's not what he meant at all. But he meant ideas are not without effects. And if you believe something, you have to think, what are the effects going to be? And how does that affect what the truth is that you believe? One of the beliefs was in God. I mean, he never let that out of his arguments. So if you believe in God, how does that make you feel? What's the effect of that, not only on you, but on the moral life of the community? And he thought that would have good effect, so why not go ahead and believe in God? Pluralism, of course, came from an enormously multicultural, diverse world that he was surrounded by. I can't say that he was living in, because James was a Boston Brahmin and he lived in his own world, and he didn't always think so highly of those multicultural, diverse voices that he was celebrating all the time. This is a big problem for liberals who would like James to have been more tolerant of other people, but he wasn't always. Nevertheless, he could see that other voices were going to have an effect in the community, right, in civic life. And he was a big proponent of participating in civil life. So pluralism, as he worked it out, accounted for those multicultural and diverse voices. And radical empiricism was very much related to the idea of pragmatism, of, your experience will teach you something, and your experience can teach you even the radical idea that you should and can believe in God. So I think that we've inherited a lot of the questions that James was dealing with, and I think that although his works are not, I would say, you can't find them at the airport, if you read them, There's a great deal that's relevant to our lives today. I think that's why we keep remembering him. I've left out all of the self-help stuff. James was a great energizer. He was always telling people, yes, you can do it, and people loved to hear him say, yes, you can do it. And that certainly was part of his popularity. But the legacy, I think, is a much more concrete and serious legacy. So I think I'm going to ask you for questions. How does that sound? Yes?
I'm a good question starter. His father, and I've forgotten all these things, his father found Schopenhauer, you were saying.
Swedenborg.
Swedenborg, sorry. Thank you. And he discovered somebody, probably massacred this also, Renouvier?
James.
Right.
William James.
Right. What influence did this guy have?
Well, Renouvier was a French philosopher. James was having a real breakdown, really like suicidal kind of breakdown. He was his very close cousin, Mary Temple, had just died of tuberculosis, and it just shattered him. Maybe he was a little bit in love with her, but somehow it just shattered him. And he had read this French philosopher and lit on the phrase, the first step to free will is believing in free will. And somehow that illuminated the world for James. And he said, okay, I'm going to believe in my own free will. So you can imagine how paralyzed he was if this was the thing that got him out of it. Or at least that's what he said got him out of it. But that's what he wrote in his diary. Now I shall believe in free will.
I read a quote that Henry James wrote like a psychologist, and William James wrote like a novelist. And do they influence each other?
Well, Henry James was very interested in the internal psychological workings of his character. He was also rebuffed by readers who had difficulty with his style. So, the early Henry James wrote perfectly clear narratives. I mean, really, anybody can read them. Even my students can read them. The later Henry James wrote convoluted, it went on and on, sentences, and that proved very difficult. And that's when that little saying started. William James didn't write like a novelist, although he was interested in the individual case. So anecdotes came easily to him. He wrote like a speaker. William James was a teacher his whole life, and he was a public speaker. And that's a different kind of sentence structure and narrative, right? I could read passages from the book that are not going to be sort of speaking passages, because when you write, it's different. But he always wrote as if he were speaking to somebody. And many of his books started out as lecture series in Oxford, in Edinburgh, at Columbia. So he just transformed them into very readable prose. And I think that's, what that comment refers to. William could not stand Henry's later work. And he said, just to please your brother, why won't you write a clear, intelligible sentence? And Henry retorted, I would rather go down to a dark grave than please you. So.
But I can't understand with his very informal education, he was able to get into Harvard Medical School.
Oh, there were no requirements. Harvard Medical School was very, very easy to get into at that time. And it was not until way after he graduated, I would say 30, 40 years after he graduated, that the medical school started being rigorous at all. No. And by the time James left Harvard, period, as a professor, he would not have been a professor. I mean, you had to have a graduate degree. You had to have some education. The children were, they were well read, but they were not formally educated by anyone. Most people think that was a good thing, and that's why they were so creative. But socially, this was very hard for them. You know, they were unto themselves in a family that was divided in terms of the attention. The two older boys were, you know, we have to take care of the two older boys. The middle boys were expendable. One of them died as an alcoholic in an institution. And the little girl was a girl. What hope was there for her, you know? So this was a very hard family, and then that was it.
Well, they moved around every place.
And
How
they moved
could
around
you have
every-
friends?
Exactly. Right, and if they got attached to a tutor, the father would jump right in and intervene. And the children were worried that it was their behavior that caused this turnover. So this was a tense family, but a family that was taught to perform in public. So friends who were in their company and did write their, you know, record what they saw, the banter, you know, the theatrics, you know, they knew how to pull it off. And that carried through, I think, for William. He really did have a talent for being a public person, although not without anxiety. Other questions?
You said that James concluded that as human beings, we can believe in God, and we should believe in God. You also said that he was a teacher all his life. Did he ever write about the results of believing in God? Did he write about warfare and tribalism based upon religious beliefs? Or, you know, the biggest crime of our century is 9/11, where 3,000 people were killed by 19 people who thought they would be rewarded in heaven. Did he write about you know, the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants at war with each other, or the Mohammedans at war with Christians? Did he write about the history of mankind as one of warfare as a result of believing in God?
It's a good question. James was a pacifist, and he wrote anti-war tracts. His exhorting people that it was okay to believe in God was a much individual, to fulfill an individual need. So being part of an institutional church, fundamentalism, that's not what he was talking about at all. He was talking about the feeling of deep loneliness in the universe and deep emptiness if you didn't feel that there was something there, and something that was real out there. The idea of a kind of nihilistic universe, which was out there in his culture, that wasn't going to make anybody feel better. But the idea that in your heart you could believe that there was a God who was a protector, a God who instilled some kind of moral values for you, that's what he was writing about. And of course, it's well taken. James, you know, he had civic responsibility, and then it went to, in some ways, but it didn't go in other ways. He was, though, a very outspoken pacifist. Yes?
Let me just add something to that, because I think the key to understanding James, and I think all of his philosophy too, is the word experience. And the key in terms of religion, the title of the book is the key, the varieties of religious experience. Because what he's talking about is a religious experience, not religious dogmatism, which are two altogether different things. In other words, if you have a religious experience, and he points that out in varieties of religious experience, it leads to saintliness, not to violence. The trouble with people who resort to violence is that they've never had a religious experience. Rather, they're seeking one, and and instead of being neurotic like James, they act it out by being violent.
I didn't tell you anything about James's psychical research.
Yeah.
But that's certainly related to his religious experience. William James, after a long time of thinking that nobody would ever marry him because he was so depressed all the time and not worthy of a woman and everything, well, then he met Alice, another Alice, and fell in love with her and pursued a kind of courtship. Just like the teaching, it was on again, off again. Yes, I'll marry. No, I won't marry. I will release her from the bond to this horrible, decrepit man. You know, so finally they got married, and she was a saint. They had some children, and they had a little boy, Herman. Herman died when he was about 2. This was a horrible, horrible loss for Alice. They really, really doted upon their children. It was well, especially Alice. I mean, she was home with them, and it was a loving family. And Herman died, and Alice was desolate. At the time, there were a lot of mediums. There were seances. You know, this was after the Civil War. This was a big burgeoning because there was loss that I think, you know, we can't conceive of it. So many fathers and brothers and sons, and they were gone. And now their child was gone. So there were a lot of people saying they could connect with the other side. And Alice and her mother found one. And William James was very, very interested in this. In a scientific way, he wanted to find one that worked. He knew that there were charlatans out there. He knew that there were tricksters. And he knew that he was not going to be duped. But he really wanted to find one that worked. And they found one. Her name was Leonora Piper. She was, they were, of course, all in the Boston area. She was up in Arlington. And they went for lots and lots and lots of seances. And she had information, you know, and she connected with the little Herman. So Alice was so relieved, and William felt that he had actually found something. At around the same time in England, the London Society for Psychical Research had been established, and then an American branch, the American Society for Psychical Research. Among their members were the most eminent scientists of the time, the most eminent. The head of the Smithsonian Institution, the president of Cornell, Freud, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, everybody was a member. So this wasn't, you know, when we talk about alternative forms of religious experience, there was a huge choice out there. And William was one of the officers of the American Society for Psychical Research, which has embarrassed some of his biographers along the way because we all know it's, you know, not true, but he believed it. And for him, that was a more authentic religious experience than going to Memorial Church and trying to pray on Sunday. He never managed to do that.
William was quite an outdoorsman, too. He was a great hiker in Adirondacks and other places.
Yeah.
How did that relate to his psyche?
It certainly related to his feeling of manhood. Manhood, right, which, remember, from the early days had been a problem. So when he was a great mountain climber, and he loved being out in the rugged outdoors and conquering the mountains. You know, he had a group of friends that he would do this. It was what we would call therapeutic. And you know, ultimately his heart did him in. He had heart trouble his whole life. Sorry.
I enjoyed your presentation. You may not be able to answer this. If he were alive today, or what he wrote about at Harvard, what would his opinion be of the rise of psychiatry, not psychology, but psychiatry, and what many people have called our therapeutic state, particularly using mind drugs? Did he ever consider, at that time period, dealing with depression through what psychiatrists sort of the benign use of mind drugs for depression. But my further question is, in terms of experience and how to experience the experience, what would his opinion have been? Timothy Leary, I assume, would not have occupied the same office at Harvard. But Leary and James may have walked in Harvard Square on Sunday afternoons. What would James' perhaps opinion have been to experience through LSD the Leary method and how it evolved later in our century?
Well, James was, he went up to the verge of that. He met Freud, for example, and during the time, besides Freud and his own theories, one of the therapies was called talking cure. So it was a lot like our therapy, where you would go and you would talk to somebody. And James tried that. Did not feel it helped him. He didn't feel it helped him that much, but he could see the value of it. He thought Freud was too interested in sex. In terms of mind-altering drugs, I think he would be very interested. Yeah, I do think so. Don't forget, he was afraid of alcohol. It's not that he didn't drink, but the children were always warned against becoming an alcoholic. And he knew that that was out there. So he wasn't going to participate in that in terms of self-medication. But he did, along the way, try something out there like ether. That's what we get. That's what they used to get for dental things. That's the right thing. Okay, so just to see the effect of it. It's not as if as a kind of scientific experiment. And most scientific people did try things on themselves. It's quite astounding that they lived, still could try things on them. So I think he would have been very interested, and I think he would have been very interested in psychiatry. What was so hard for him and the people of his generation is that disclosure. Quite aside from psychiatry, think about the intimate information that we publicize. You meet somebody and in 5 minutes you know things that maybe is a little bit too much information, but that's fine. Think about all of the talk shows. So that was not available. What was available was a public image of normalcy. And anybody who didn't fit that thought that they were deeply flawed. So flawed that they should never get married and pass on their genes to somebody else. That's how really bad it was. That's why James wrote this essay, The Hidden Self, which his sister, who had had breakdown after breakdown after breakdown, found so helpful. Because, okay, there was a hidden self. Other people had one too. And maybe it wasn't what you revealed to other people, but it didn't mean that you were this black, dark, festering, horrible. This was a time when people didn't know what dreams were, James included, whether dreams were visitations from spirits in the night. So he would have had to come a long way, but I think he would have felt that it was liberating to come that way. Even if we had to deal with Freud and get him out of the way, and deal with somebody else. I can only guess.
Well, thank you so much, Linda.
Oh, you're welcome.